Hello, everybody. So we have a great lineup of early career investigators and trainees. I'd just like to mention that we got several high quality abstracts, and they're all available in the poster viewing platform. So you should make sure to check it out. But the first talk today would be Shalmali Bane. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Epidemiology here at the Stanford School of Medicine. She works with Dr. Susan Carmichael on examining the social determinants of reproductive health and perinatal outcomes. And she has a degree in biology from Stanford, and she's previously worked as a healthcare consultant focused on survey research and budget modeling. And her talk is titled Variability in Risk Factors for Maternal and Infant Health and Perinatal Outcomes in Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander individuals giving birth in California.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Shalmali Bane, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health, advised by Dr. Susan Carmichael and Dr. Julia Simard. And today I'll be presenting on my project examining the variability and risk factors among Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander populations in California. I will abbreviate this population as ANHPI for the rest of my presentation. So this should be very evident to those who attended the earlier presentation today, but it's known that there remain persistent racial and ethnic disparities in maternal outcomes, particularly for Black and Native American populations in the United States. In this case, even considering race as a socially constructed factor, a lot of work remains to be done. My work for this project is examining the ANHPI subgroup in particular, which is the fastest growing racial ethnic group in the United States, accounting for 7% of US births and 17% of births in California, making California uniquely suited for our analysis. Despite this, ANHPIs are both underfunded and understudied in the NIH. I should mention that the term ANHPI, or API, as you may see it standing for Asian Pacific Islander, exists to group individuals in the United States from about 30 or so nations of origin geographically clustered in Asia, including South Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific Islands. So when studies do exist in this population, they typically aggregate into one pool. And this has two chief consequences. One, we mask the diversity among these different subgroups. And two, we make shaping downstream policy challenging because we can't really address the unique health needs of specific subgroups in this population. When research that does exist disaggregates populations, we found notable limitations, including sample size constraints, especially for smaller subgroups, low quality data, piecemeal evidence, so really only looking at certain questions or certain risk factors in certain subgroups or focusing on subpopulations like immigrants. And then also some studies had very narrow research questions. So as a first step or foray into this space, we conducted a descriptive analysis of a variety of risk factors for maternal and infant health among ANHPI populations. And specifically, we looked at socio-demographic and clinical risk factors, as well as a few selected outcomes, and we disaggregated by the racial ethnic subgroups. We used 10 years of data from California, a notable feature being that we have access to linked records. So we have birth certificate files linked with discharge data, linked with geocoded maternal address, which we could then use to employ information from the American Community Survey. So we ended up with a population of about 750,000 linked births to ANHPI individuals, and broken out into our 15 subgroups that ranged from about 28% Chinese to 0.3% Guamanian. And these subgroups were informed by the categories available in the birth certificate file. So we did our best to drill down to the most granular level of racial ethnic data that we had available to us. And then, as I mentioned, this is a descriptive study of a sort of litany of variables. You'll see them in the results. And this is truly just the first step into kind of examining how we're going to continue to study ANHPI populations in maternal health. So I should warn you, the next slide is incredibly data rich, but I will walk everyone through it slowly and highlight a few key results. So this sort of heat map was our main finding from this paper. The columns are individual racial ethnic subgroups within ANHPI, and each row is a risk factor that we selected. I then applied this sort of heat map style coloring where for most variables, a red color would signify a worse score or a higher prevalence of a risk factor, and green would mean a lower score or lower prevalence. There's a few risk factors for which this was shifted or switched. So now I should say that if we were expecting to see a bunch of homogeneous subgroups, then every single group would look very similar to this last column over here of overall. And in fact, the information in this column is what you would see if we presented data for API or ANHPI as a single subgroup. However, we see substantial variability. We see different patterns between the columns, as well as none of these subgroups quite look like overall. And so this supports our hypothesis that in this case, aggregating is masking the true diversity of information we have here. Two other things I'd like to highlight is that no two subgroups in this table look entirely similar. No two columns are entirely same in the coloring of the pattern. And no single subgroup is consistently better or worse off than others across all our examined covariates. There are certainly subgroups that are similar for subsets, but not across the board. And then finally, I just wanted to note the substantial variability we see for a single risk factor. And this ranged from a 2-fold variability to an almost 200-fold variability for certain risk factors. So while this was our main finding, I wanted to pull out one other sort of interesting finding that we had, which is that for certain risk factors and outcomes that have known associations in the literature, we didn't always see that pattern in our data. So taking the example of education and obesity, which are both risk factors known to be associated with gestational diabetes and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, you would expect higher obesity and lower education attainment to be associated with higher rates of GDM and HDP. However, there were subgroups for which this was true and subgroups for which this pattern did not hold. So singling out just two sample examples, we see that in Indian subgroups, higher obesity, lower education corresponded with higher rates of, higher education and lower obesity corresponded with higher rates of GDM, and then the reverse for Samoan populations. This was true for other subsets, including SMM, severe maternal morbidity, and cesarean birth and prenatal care and severe maternal morbidity as well. So the takeaways from this study are that substantial variability exists among the distribution of risk factors for perinatal health for ANHPI subgroups, and sometimes the patterns between risk factors and subgroups is not readily predictable or not what you would necessarily expect based on the literature. So future studies and our future work will consider disaggregating ANHPI subgroups where possible. And the next step that I think is really interesting will be empirically assessing where we then can aggregate in a data-informed manner, where we can aggregate subgroups. Additionally, there's more work to be done on individual risk factors and multi-level factors that inform population attributable risks, as well as sort of building in dimensions of nativity and rurality. So I'd like to thank my research team for this project, as well as Dr. Carmichael and Palaniappan for the opportunity to work on this paper, and the Stanford Center for Asian Health Research and Education seed grant funding.
Thank you, Shalmali, for that really wonderful presentation. So as for waiting for questions, I think one question that I had was that, what are some challenges associated with obtaining disaggregated data, right? So you picked the birth data from California, which I think they already do some disaggregation for you, right? But then if we were to try to expand this to, include data from other states, or maybe people who are not born in California, but who live here, right? What are some challenges that you think we need to overcome? And do you have any thoughts on how we might approach this? Maybe too broad of a question, but yeah.
Well, I don't know if I have great solutions yet, but I will sort of validate that often, even with our massive data set, you can run into sample size constraints. So for example, a research topic I'm interested in is stillbirth, and I don't know if we in good faith would have enough stillbirth in this massive population, even in California, to look at it disaggregated by race ethnicity. Also, when you don't have state data, sort of another common data source would be claims data, and typically you're just not going to get anything, if at all, if you're able to get race ethnicity, you're not going to get it beyond the API level. So I will say, I don't know if there's a great way to kind of back it out when you don't have it, But my takeaway is when you do have access to it and you do have birth certificate data or vital record data, the onus sort of is on the researchers. If you're examining racial and ethnic disparities, which I feel like everyone should be, that you should just drill down to the sort of deepest level possible.